Well, you guys are a distance away anyway, so that's... They kind of throw you off your game when they get so darn close there. I'm Marti Johnson, one of the lay leaders here at St. Paul's, and I'm happy to be with you today and honored that I was asked to speak to you. Humankind is full of differences. We learn as children to accept others of a different color, race, and religion. I was also taught, as I'm sure you were, to be kind and accepting to those that are less fortunate due to crippling or deforming disabilities. But what about the invisible disabilities, mental illness or learning impairment? I am not a stranger to invisible disabilities such as mental illness. My oldest brother Keith had paranoid schizophrenia, and in recent years, I have had a grandson, Cash, diagnosed with extreme autism. Both of these disabilities were and are isolating, not just for the ones afflicted, but the whole family. First, my journey with Keith. It was Christmas, the tree lights were glowing, familiar Christmas hymns were playing, and the house smelled sweet and warm, but it was silent, other than some whispering, my mother's soft crying, and my father telling my mom that everything would be okay. He would find help, and that by the grace of God, we would get through this. A few days later, my parents were heading to Great Falls to see a special doctor because Keith was sick. My 4-year-old mind thought, how can he be sick when he looks just fine? I was left with friends a lot in the next few years as my parents visited doctors with Keith. My 2 other siblings were much older too and busy with their own lives. My parents did find help, which was fortunate in the late 1950s, but the unfortunate part of that puzzle was that there were not great treatments for mental illness. Keith was given shock treatments that were less than perfected and medications that were an unknown. Through all of this, my dad would tell us that this was his cross to bear and that he believes that God walks with him. With faith, we will get through this. He was Keith's main caretaker, and my mom guided the rest of the family. My parents were steadfast in following Jesus and were active members of St. Paul's Methodist Church. This was back when we attended over at the little tiny church that was once where our parking lot is, and it was a safe and warm place to be, and I loved it as a child. We had many family friends there, but I found out later that not many of them knew about Keith's sickness and what it was and how it affected our family. It was a hidden illness full of shame and guilt. It would have been so much easier to explain if Keith was visibly crippled or disabled in some way. People would readily sympathize and understand. Many times I would wake in the night to see my dad sitting in his recliner, alone in the dark, his face full of grief and exhaustion. He never did complain or say, why me, why us, but smiled, loved, and carried on through the next day. Psalm 139, 13 and 14 says, for it is you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Keith did have friends in high school. He loved Elvis. He had the kind of personality where he'd play the 45 over and it was on repeat, and my mom would finally have to say, okay, we got it. So I knew all the words. He loved the twist. He loved football and baseball. He played on sports teams and was a really good athlete, although at times his temper and delusions would interfere, which we kind of decided maybe wasn't really unlike a teenage boy after all. I think most of them just thought he was being a jerk like they all could be. It was later in life when he tried to keep a job that we really realized how hard it was for him to get along with others and for others to understand him. He graduated from Carroll College in accounting, Always having loved numbers, he would write them everywhere. And he had job after job that didn't work. Our family revolved around Keith's illness. If he was having a good day, then we all could. And as a teenager, I was full of resentment. Teenage girls, you know, you want the world to revolve around you, and that wasn't happening for me. He was in his 20s, still living at home, and he was really crimping my style. Later in my life, I understood more as I studied about schizophrenia, but still wasn't really sure of how to accept him closely into my life. In early adulthood, when I was working at Carroll College, I had a reality check. I was on the phone with a coworker when she said, "Don't look now, but here comes a real degenerate coming up the stairs." My heart pounded as I knew in a split second that it was Keith. He loved Carroll College and was so proud that I had a job there. I snuck out the side door of my office and hid in the bathroom for a while. I couldn't face admitting that this unkempt, loud person was my brother. Would people understand? Would they judge me and my family? Then I felt guilt. Keith had been shunned, stared at, and ignored many times. But by me, later I felt horrible. Intertwined in Keith's illness and the devastation he had on our life, and on his especially, there was my parents' strong faith and the Methodist church where they were involved and active. Many times over Keith's life, he would have been homeless if it was not for a caring, supportive family that sought safe places for him to live. Keith was married for a few years, and I believe found happiness in knowing that he was a bit like the rest of us in that relationship. It didn't last due to the illnesses they both suffered, but it was a good chapter for him. Returning to his homelessness and wandering, Keith would take off and eventually be found by law enforcement in a park, maybe in Denver, maybe in Minneapolis. Once he took off to go, he wanted to see the Twins stadium there. And there was no forewarning, you know, he'd just hop in his car and go, and sometimes I think that'd be kind of nice, but it was startling for the rest of us. My dad would always go get him and bring him back home. There was a time that he lived in his car with his dog Patch. They both seemed well and happy, and like they were eating well, even though it's not the life we had hoped for him. Some statistics about mental illness. Half of all adults will suffer from mental illness in their lifetime. Half of all chronic mental illness begins by the age of 14. 1 in 5 children will have a mental illness by age 18, and 90% of people who die by suicide also had a mental illness. In the later years of Keith's life, he ended up in Warm Springs due to some legal issues, then a nursing home in Lewistown that could also assist people with mental illness plus physical illnesses, as he had Parkinson's by then. And finally, he came to a nursing home in Helena. My father had passed away by the time he was in Lewistown, but my sister and I would go there monthly to visit Keith. And my mom was forever the eternal, you know, optimist and had the hope of a parent. She was always wanting Keith to eat better and stop smoking, but by that time, smoking was like the one thing I think he had that was a pleasure. And when he was hard to understand with his Parkinson's, and one time he told us that they had been giving him Boost, which in his words, it sounded like booze. And so we thought, well, maybe that would help his mood a little bit anyway. What the heck? After my mom passed and my sister was ill, I visited Keith almost daily at the nursing home in Helena. Through my daily visits, I continued to learn more about the complexity of his illness. He was an amazing mixture of brilliance and confusion. He could recite details about our family history, Montana history, and US history. His mind was a trap, and it was obvious that he had studied, listened, and retained a great deal. On other days, he would still be delusional about a doctor that wanted to pull all of his teeth out, or that someone was living in his closet. On a whole, I received many, many gifts from my brother. The gift of slowing down and really taking time to listen and watch, seeking understanding and showing compassion before snap judgments or labels, looking beyond the surface of someone's outer appearance, and above all, remembering that each person I encounter is someone's son or daughter, brother or sister. I went on many outings with my brother in the nursing home van as he couldn't get out of his chair. Once I was at the farmer's market and I noticed disapproving stares from a man probably about my age. You see, Keith was still a mess. He was drooling, shaking, his clothes didn't fit right. His feet were only covered as socks as we couldn't get shoes on him. I looked into the man's eyes and said, "Isn't it great that these folks can enjoy the market with all of us?" He only turned away. We measure quality of life by productivity. What career do we have? What do we own? Where do we live? What do we drive? God measures by love. God's values are different. Some would say that something happened when Keith was created, that God messed up. I think God values us just as we are. Our society is just waking up to this truth. In the last 25 years, strides have been made in diagnosing, understanding, and treating mental illness. Today, I have 16 grandchildren, and among them is Cash, a beautiful brown-eyed boy with extreme autism. He jumps continually, makes loud noises, can be destructive and mean, is nonverbal at 4 years old. Through my journey with Keith, I know that what Cash needs from his family is so different from the therapies, rules, judgments that he receives at school and in society. His soul needs love, acceptance, kindness, and dignity because he is a valuable, special, cherished child of God. Disabled or not, like the Sneetches the kids learned about, whether you have a star on your belly or not does not really matter. One was not inferior to another. Dr. Seuss wrote Sneetches to teach children about discrimination and address how different groups of people didn't like each other during World War II. A number of Seuss books address the subject of diversity and teach children to be fair and treat people equally. We all know we shouldn't discriminate based on race, but how often do we discriminate on mental illness? We expect people to hold a job that just aren't capable of it. What thoughts do we have when we see the homeless person on the corner, or the person who is dirty with torn clothes sleeping in the park? What assumptions do we make? Do we believe that they could find a job if they tried? Maybe they could, but we always need to consider that they aren't able to do so and send a prayer in their direction. I'm still trying to make sense of the times when God doesn't heal, even though I know God's grace is there. I'm trying to understand the sense of people being born with disabilities, invisible or not, that last a lifetime, and I know God's grace is there as well. I have more questions than answers, and God's grace is in both of them. I am comforted and strengthened by this grace. As my dad said, God walks with us, bringing us strength and courage. God's grace is sufficient for me in my relationship with Keith and also my grandson Cash, with all the answers I have now and with all the questions that continue. Romans 8:38 and 39 says, "For I am persuaded that neither death or life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other creature shall be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Jesus Christ our Lord." I have learned this lesson many times over in my life and in many ways, but none more powerful than through the differences it has taken me a lifetime to understand, accept, and see as part of God's grace for me. I wish all of us the same.